The candles were still burning in the throne room when the ministers arrived to arrest their own king. He was in a locked chamber, dressed for the opera, speaking to servants who were no longer in the building. His country still called him Majesty. His treasury had not been able to pay him for months. Somewhere in a Bavarian file, 3 doctors had already signed a paper declaring him insane, and none of them had ever met him. This is the story of 10 monarchs who watched their kingdoms collapse from the inside and lost their minds while doing it. Number 10 begins on the shore of a Bavarian lake in June 1886, where 2 bodies were pulled from shallow water that should not have been able to kill anyone. One belonged to a doctor, the other belonged to a king. Ludwig II came to the throne at 18, tall and dark-eyed, and already uncomfortable with people. Bavaria was still an independent kingdom then, with its own army, its own foreign policy, and its own royal court in Munich. He inherited a country that still believed in kings. What he wanted was Wagner. What he wanted was moonlight. What he wanted was the medieval fantasies he had grown up reading about, and he had the tax revenue of a kingdom to build them with. Neuschwanstein rose out of the mountains like something a child had drawn. Linderhof followed, with a grotto inside it where he staged private operas for an audience of no one. Herrenchiemsee was modeled on Versailles and never finished. Then history closed in. In 1871, Bavaria was folded into a Prussian-led German empire. Ludwig refused to attend the ceremony that made his kingdom a junior partner in someone else's empire. His kingdom still had a king. But the king now answered, quietly, to Berlin. He retreated. He stopped going to Munich. He held cabinet meetings by letter. He slept during the day. He dined alone at tables set for guests who never came. He dismissed staff for looking at him directly, and the bills kept coming. By 1885, his debts had reached 14 million marks. His ministers refused to raise more loans. He tried other European royal houses. They refused too. He proposed dismissing his entire cabinet and ruling alone. That was the moment the cabinet decided to remove him instead. The official version sounded medical. 4 psychiatrists, headed by Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, declared the king incurably paranoid, without ever examining him. They worked from second-hand descriptions supplied by disgruntled servants. It was politics wearing a stethoscope. On the 12th of June, 1886, officials arrived at Neuschwanstein to arrest him. Ludwig was told he was no longer king and escorted to Berg Castle on Lake Starnberg, its windows locked. The next evening, he asked Dr. von Gudden if they could walk together by the lake, without guards. Von Gudden agreed. They did not come back. Their bodies were found in shallow water hours later. Ludwig's watch had stopped at 6:45. Von Gudden had bruises on his face and neck. Neither of them was supposed to be able to drown there. No inquest ever settled it. Suicide, accident, escape attempt, murder. Bavaria has been arguing about it for 140 years. Within 7 weeks of his death, his fantasy palaces were opened to paying tourists to help settle the debts. Today, Neuschwanstein sells about 1.5 million tickets a year. Bavaria still sells the fantasy that killed him. Ludwig's collapse took years. The next king was already broken before he ever took the throne. Number 9 belongs to a boy crowned at 17. Christian VII of Denmark came to a throne that still carried real weight. Norway attached to it, parts of the Baltic answering to it. From adolescence, something had been visibly wrong with him. Modern historians believe he suffered from schizophrenia. He beat himself in private. He giggled inappropriately during ceremonies. He believed at times that he was not real. His tutor had beaten him savagely as a child. He arrived at the throne already fragile, and the crown made it worse. He was married almost immediately to Caroline Matilda of Britain, a girl of 15 raised at Kew, who spoke almost no Danish. Within a year, he was refusing to sleep in the same rooms as her. Within 2 years, the court was quietly discussing who would actually run the country. The answer arrived in the person of Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German doctor hired to accompany the king on a European tour in 1768. Struensee could calm the king's episodes. He could get him to sign documents. Within 2 years, Struensee was, in effect, running Denmark. He wrote the laws under Christian's rubber-stamped name. He abolished torture and censorship and forced labor by cabinet order, and he was sleeping with the Queen. The counter-coup came in January 1772. A group of nobles led by the king's stepmother stormed the palace at 3 in the morning. Struensee was arrested in his bed, tortured, tried, and executed publicly 3 months later. His right hand was cut off before his head. Caroline Matilda was stripped of her title, separated from her children, and exiled to a castle in northern Germany, where she died 3 years later at 23. Christian remained king. That is the astonishing part. Denmark did not depose him. Denmark did not need to. He would remain on the throne for another 36 years while other people ruled in his name. Court physicians described him hitting himself until he bruised. He believed his body was made of someone else's flesh. He talked to imaginary companions. Laws that Denmark still, in some form, lives with were issued under a signature that was, in its final years, mechanical. The state functioned. His son eventually took over as regent in 1784 and simply governed around him. They did not need to remove him. They just stopped listening. Christian's kingdom outlived his sanity by nearly 4 decades. The next monarch's kingdom died first and took what was left of him with it. Number 8 is a 20th century story. Farouk of Egypt came to the throne in 1936 at 16, handsome and multilingual and Cambridge educated. Cairo cheered him. Newspapers put him on the front page. He was photographed with generals, film stars, racehorses. On the surface, he was exactly what a monarchy is supposed to look like in the modern age. Underneath, everything was rented. British troops still garrisoned the Suez Canal. In 1942, during the Second World War, the British ambassador Miles Lampson drove a column of tanks up to Abdeen Palace and told Farouk, at gunpoint essentially, which prime minister to appoint. Farouk appointed him. He was 22. He never forgot it. Something in him began to close. In 1948, Egypt was humiliated in the war with Israel. The army blamed the palace. Weapons had arrived defective. Contracts had gone to the king's friends. The rumor spread that Farouk's court had profited off the same war the soldiers were dying in. When those soldiers came home, some of them began meeting in small rooms in Cairo. One of them was a colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser. While the officers organized, the king unraveled in public. He gained weight month by month until he could not fit into his uniforms. He collected obsessively, postage stamps by the tens of thousands, aspirin bottles, razor blades, luxury cars. He owned close to 100 and could not drive most of them. His court physicians described a man in psychological freefall, paranoia, insomnia, compulsive spending. He was not clinically insane. He was disintegrating in front of everyone. The coup came on the night of the 23rd of July, 1952. Nasser's free officers took Cairo. The army had switched sides quietly weeks earlier. Farouk was surrounded in his summer palace in Alexandria and given a choice, abdicate or die. He abdicated. On the 26th, he boarded his royal yacht in full white admiral's uniform and sailed for Italy. The Egyptian flag was raised on the harbor buildings behind him. He was 32. He would never see Egypt again. He drifted between hotels and rented villas in Italy and Monaco. His weight climbed past 135 kilograms. On the night of the 18th of March, 1965, he sat down for dinner at a restaurant in Rome. 12 courses: oysters, lamb, lobster, dessert, cigars afterward. He lit the cigar, leaned forward, and collapsed onto the table. He was pronounced dead within the hour. His stamp collection was auctioned off by the republic that had overthrown him. He fled with 200 pieces of luggage. Egypt kept the country. Number 7 belongs to a boy who spent 22 years locked in a small room in Constantinople, expecting the executioner every morning. Ibrahim of the Ottomans entered the cafes, the cage, a set of rooms inside the Topkapi Palace where princes lived, waiting to be summoned or murdered. He grew up with no education, no companions, no windows. He heard through the walls when his brothers were killed. He was told, more than once, that he was next. In February 1640, his brother Murad IV died without a male heir. Ibrahim was the last living male of the House of Osman. A delegation came to the cage to inform him. He refused to open the door. He believed they had come to strangle him. They had to bring his brother's corpse to the doorway before he would believe it. Only then did he emerge, blinking in daylight he had barely seen for 2 decades. He was 24 and had just become sultan of an empire from Algeria to the Persian Gulf. He never adjusted. The chronicles describe erratic decrees, uncontrollable rages, paranoid tantrums. Modern historians are careful here. The Ottoman chronicles were written by the men who later helped depose him, and much of it is propaganda. What is defensible is that Ibrahim had been traumatized in ways that made rule almost impossible, and that a costly war over Crete emptied the treasury. In August 1648, the Janissaries, the same soldiers who had crowned him, allied with the clergy and deposed him. 10 days later, they strangled him in a cell in the same palace. He was 32. Court chroniclers gave him the name that outlived him, Deli Ibrahim, Ibrahim the Mad. The Ottomans built a system to protect their throne by breaking their princes, then acted surprised when the prince who inherited it was already broken. They locked him up so no one would kill him, then killed him for what the lock had done. Number 6 is a queen who screamed across the Atlantic. Maria I of Portugal came to the throne in 1777. Portugal was small in Europe, but enormous in empire. Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, parts of India. Maria was pious to the point of severity. She commissioned the Basilica of Estrela in Lisbon, a white-domed church that still dominates the skyline. She was called Maria the Pious. The weakness under the surface was grief, and it arrived in waves. In the late 1780s, her husband died, then her eldest son, then her confessor, then her daughter. Contemporary physicians described her sinking into a religious melancholia that modern psychiatry would probably call psychotic depression. She began to hear voices. She saw her dead father burning in hell and screamed for him. In February 1792, she was officially declared unfit to rule. Her son Juan took over as regent. That is the state she was in when Napoleon marched on the Iberian Peninsula. In November 1807, French troops crossed the Portuguese border with orders to seize Lisbon and depose the royal family. The British Navy proposed something no European monarchy had ever done: evacuate the entire court across the Atlantic. 15,000 people, the treasury, the archives, the crown jewels, were loaded onto ships and taken to Rio de Janeiro. Maria was carried aboard the Príncipe Real on the 27th of November. She was 72. Witnesses described her screaming that they were taking her to be killed. The crossing took almost 2 months. She arrived in Rio in March 1808 and was carried off into a country she never understood she was in. The Portuguese Empire, extraordinarily, continued to function from Brazil for over a decade. Rio de Janeiro was, briefly, the capital of a European empire. Maria the Pious sat in a tropical palace watching for demons. She died in Rio in 1816 at 81. Her body was preserved and shipped back to Portugal 3 years later. She is buried in the Basilica of Estrela, the church she had commissioned herself decades earlier, in the years when her mind still worked. She crossed an ocean. She never left 1792. Number 5 is a queen Spanish historians are still arguing about. Juana of Castile was the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, the monarchs who united Spain and funded Columbus. She was sister to Catherine of Aragon. In 1496, she married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. By 1500, after her siblings died one by one, she was heir to a united Spain. When Isabella died in 1504, Juana was, in law, the Queen of Castile, and this is where the record becomes contested. Juana's father Ferdinand did not want to lose power. Her husband Philip did not want to share it. Both moved to have her declared incapable of ruling. Court accounts began appearing about her erratic behavior, jealousy, tantrums, refusal to eat. Some came from people with political reasons to sideline her. Modern historians like Bethany Aram have argued carefully that much of the evidence for her madness was manufactured or produced under duress. In 1506, Philip died suddenly at 28. According to accounts written after the fact, Juana refused to bury him. She traveled with his coffin through Spain. She opened it to check the body. The story became the foundation of her legend. Historians now note that traveling with a coffin was not, in fact, unusual in high Catholic mourning of the period, and that many of the hostile details come from sources with agendas. What is certain is that she was grieving publicly and refusing to make political decisions her father wanted her to make. In 1509, Ferdinand had her confined to the fortress convent of Tordesillas. Officially, she was there to be cared for. In practice, she was a prisoner. When Ferdinand died in 1516, her son Charles V continued the confinement. He was ruling as regent in her name, and if she were ever released and declared sane, his own authority would collapse. She stayed in Tordesillas for 46 years. She signed no laws. She attended no ceremonies. She was, throughout that entire time, legally the Queen of Castile. She died in Tordesillas in 1555 at 75. Whether she was ever actually mad is one of the great open questions of Spanish historiography. The room she was kept in still exists. Visitors can walk through it. Her father took her freedom. Her son took her decades. History took her name. Number 4 is a king who believed his own body was made of glass. Charles VI of France came to the throne in 1380 at 11, in the middle of the 100 Years' War. When he began ruling in his own name in his early 20s, the court celebrated. They called him Bien-Aimé, the beloved. Then, on a summer day in August 1392, everything changed. Charles was riding through a forest near Le Mans. A ragged man ran out of the trees, grabbed the bridle of the king's horse, and shouted about betrayal. Attendants pulled the man away. A few minutes later, a page dropped a lance. The metal clanged against a helmet. Charles drew his sword and attacked his own knights. He killed 4 of them before he was subdued. He did not recognize any of them. For the next 30 years, Charles VI of France lived in cycles of madness and lucidity that his court simply had to work around. The episodes could last for months. He did not know his own name. He did not recognize his wife, Isabeau of Bavaria. He did not recognize his children. He refused to bathe for so long that his attendants had to trick him, and he became convinced, in one of the most famous of his delusions, that his body was made of glass. He had iron rods sewn into his clothes to protect the fragile crystal he believed he was carrying. He believed that if anyone bumped into him, he would shatter. And here is where the crack in the king became the crack in the country. His brother, Louis of Orléans, and his cousin John of Burgundy began to fight over who would rule during his absences. Louis was assassinated in the streets of Paris in 1407. France split into 2 armed factions and began a civil war inside itself, while the English were still waiting across the Channel. In October 1415, at Agincourt, English longbowmen destroyed the flower of the French nobility in an afternoon. Charles, in Paris, was in one of his absent phases. The document that finished it came in 1420. During one of his lucid intervals, and this is what makes it terrible, Charles signed the Treaty of Troyes. He acknowledged Henry V of England as heir to the throne of France. His own son, the Dauphin Charles, was disinherited. The kingdom was to be handed to the English by legal instrument. The treaty still exists. His signature on it is legible. 2 years later, he died. The disinheritance was eventually reversed, but it took Joan of Arc and years of warfare to undo. France almost ceased to be France because a mind of glass held the pen. Number 3 is the shortest life in this entire video, and possibly the cruelest. Ivan VI was proclaimed Emperor of all the Russias at 2 months old. Empress Anna, dying without direct heirs, named him her successor. Coins were struck with his infant face. For 13 months, an empire stretching from Poland to the Pacific was ruled, in name, by a baby who could not yet sit up. The coup came on the night of the 25th of November, 1741. Elizabeth, the daughter of Peter the Great, marched into the Winter Palace with a regiment of soldiers and had the infant emperor removed from his cradle. He was taken from his mother when he was about 4. He grew up with a single guardian in a small suite of rooms, forbidden all contact with the outside world. In 1756, at 15, he was moved to the Schlüsselburg fortress on Lake Ladoga. He was placed in solitary confinement. The guards were given standing orders. They were not to tell him his name. They were not to teach him to read. They were not to let him see another human face. He knew, somehow. He would sometimes speak brokenly of being a great person, of being someone the world owed something to. The guards were instructed to ignore him. He was labeled in official correspondence as the nameless prisoner. Catherine the Great eventually inherited the problem. Somewhere in a fortress cell, there was a young man who was, by strict dynastic law, still the rightful emperor of Russia. She wrote the order. If anyone ever tried to free the nameless prisoner, the guards were to kill him immediately, without waiting for further instructions. Then, in July 1764, a young lieutenant named Vasily Mirovich learned who the nameless prisoner really was. He organized a small group of soldiers and stormed the inner cell. The guards did exactly what they had been ordered to do. Before Mirovich could reach the door, they killed Ivan in his bed. He was 23 years old. He had spent all but 4 months of his life in confinement. He was crowned before he could speak. He was killed before he learned his name. Number 2 is the longest exile in modern royal history. Wilhelm II lost the greatest empire in Europe in a single afternoon. He spent the next 22 years in a Dutch village, chopping down trees and waiting for a telephone call that never came. He is the case in this list where insane needs the most careful handling, because he was not, in any clinical sense, mad. What he had was a prolonged, obsessive, delusional refusal to accept that the world had moved on. Wilhelm came to the throne in 1888 as Kaiser of a unified Germany. He inherited an industrial economy overtaking Britain, a navy built to challenge the Royal Navy, and colonies in Africa, the Pacific, and China. His grandmother was Queen Victoria. His cousin was Nicholas II of Russia. He wore parade uniforms designed by his own tailors. The withered left arm, a birth injury, was hidden in every photograph. The war came in August 1914. 4 years later, in November 1918, it was over. The German fleet mutinied at Kiel. His generals told him the troops would no longer fight for him personally. His ministers told him to abdicate. He refused. He negotiated. On the 9th of November, without waiting for his authorization, the Chancellor announced his abdication to the public. That afternoon, Wilhelm boarded a train and crossed into the Netherlands. Queen Wilhelmina granted him asylum. He would never see Germany again. He bought a country house, Huisdoorn, and moved in with 59 railway cars of personal belongings, furniture from his palaces, portraits, silverware, uniforms, thousands of books. His entire palace inventory reassembled in a Dutch village. And then, for 22 years, he chopped down trees. He rose in the morning, put on gardening clothes, and went out with an axe. He cut down thousands of trees. He kept an axe collection. It is still on display at the museum today. He wrote obsessive, anti-Semitic memoirs, blaming the loss of his throne on a Jewish conspiracy. He blamed the socialists. He blamed his generals. He believed in the 1930s that Adolf Hitler might restore the monarchy and put him back in Berlin. He was wrong. Hitler despised the Hohenzollern family. He died in June 1941 at 82. He is buried in a mausoleum on the grounds of Huisdoorn. He left orders that he was not to be returned to Germany until the monarchy was restored. It has not been. He is still there. He kept the uniforms. Germany kept moving. Number 1 is a man who watched the largest land empire in human history collapse around him and wrote in his diary that the weather was pleasant. Nicholas II inherited an empire that on the surface looked invincible. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg had 1,100 rooms. The Romanov dynasty had ruled for 300 years. The Trans-Siberian Railway was being built across 7 time zones. When the family celebrated the 300th anniversary of the dynasty in 1913, ministers reported crowds cheering the Tsar in every city. The weakness under the surface was that Nicholas did not want any of it. He was shy. He preferred his family to his ministers. He had told a cousin, in tears, that he did not know how to be Tsar. He married Alexandra of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and their 5th child and only son, Alexei, was born with hemophilia, a bleeding disorder that could kill him at any moment. That secret shaped everything. Because Alexei's illness could not be publicly acknowledged, the family withdrew. Because it terrified Alexandra, she became obsessed with anyone who could relieve her son's pain. That eventually included a Siberian mystic named Grigory Rasputin, whose influence became one of the most damaging rumors of the reign. In 1905, peaceful demonstrators marching to the Winter Palace to petition the Tsar were fired on by imperial troops. Hundreds died. Bloody Sunday broke, for a generation of Russians, the belief that the Tsar was the father of the people. In 1914, Nicholas committed Russia to the World War. Millions died in the first 2 years. In 1915, he took personal command of the army and moved to the front. Every defeat was now, personally, his. Ministers were appointed on Rasputin's advice. The court became a scandal the country was reading about. In December 1916, aristocrats murdered Rasputin. It changed nothing. In February 1917, bread riots broke out in Petrograd. The garrison refused to fire on the crowds. Within days, the regime collapsed. Nicholas was on his train, returning from the front, when his generals informed him that the war and the throne could not both be saved. He abdicated. He did more than that. In an act that was not really legal, he abdicated for his hemophiliac son as well, passing the throne to his brother Michael, who refused it within 24 hours. The Romanov dynasty ended on a railway car in a snowstorm outside Pskov on the 15th of March 1917. What followed is the part that is hardest to read. The family was placed under house arrest, first at Tsarskoye Selo, then Tobolsk in Siberia. Then, after the Bolsheviks took power, a merchant's house in Yekaterinburg, the Ipatiev house. And throughout all of it, Nicholas kept his diary. He had kept it since childhood. The diary survives. It is one of the most disturbing documents of the 20th century, not because of what it says, but because of what it does not. Through the collapse of the war, through the loss of the throne, through the arrests and the moves, the diary is a record of the weather. It is a record of walks in the garden. It notes when tea was served. It rarely mentions Russia. He does not seem, page after page, to fully register what is happening to him. Was it denial? Was it dissociation? Was it faith? Historians have argued for a century. On the night of the 16th into the 17th of July 1918, the family was awoken and told they were being moved for their safety. They were taken to the cellar of the Ipatiev house. Alexei was carried in his father's arms. A firing squad entered the room. They were all killed. The bodies were removed and buried in a shallow pit in a forest outside the city. The site was hidden for over 60 years. The Ipatiev house was demolished by Soviet order in 1977. A church stands on the spot now, called the Church on the Blood. The bones were located in 1979, but not exhumed until 1991. The last entry in his diary, written the evening of the 16th of July 1918, hours before he was taken to the cellar, notes that the day was warm, that the family had read together, and that Alexei had taken his first proper bath in a long time. It does not mention what came next. He did not know what came next. But even if he had, you get the sense, reading the diary, that he might not have written it down. 10 rulers, 10 kingdoms. Some cracked before the fall. Some cracked because of it. Some were locked in rooms until the world outside had rearranged itself without them. Some watched their empires collapse and refused, page after page, to record that they had seen it. Royalty is not permanent. Neither, sometimes, is the mind that has to watch it end,